Smoke does not smell like a campfire. It smells like the whole world catching at once. Resin and scorched pine, and something else underneath it, something the body knows in the gut before the mind has words for it. A smell that means run and run now, and do not look back. She smelled it before she saw a single flame, smelled it the same as you smell a held breath in a room. And by the time the orange showed through the trees down the valley, the wind had already decided, and the only road out of Cinder Gulch was a wall of fire, and she was not even running for herself. Then a shadow came down off the high rock through the smoke, huge and silent, and a voice scraped against the roar, low and flat and smelling even there of ash and pine pitch and cold stone. You can't outrun it. Get on my back. Rewind. 3 days before the fire took the valley, the woman who would owe a stranger her life and despise him for it was standing in the rutted single street of a timber camp called Cinder Gulch, watching the man who owned the place, a timber baron named Augustus Thorne, tell the camp there was no fire danger. He was lying. In 3 days, that lie would burn the valley and leave a crippled old man named Eli Pruitt behind in the smoke, and she would be the only soul who turned back for him. Her name was Naomi Hart, and she was 23 years old, and the smell of the place had reached her on the stage road an hour before the buildings did. Green sawdust and pitch and the Swedish reek of a meat barrel, left too long in the sun behind a tent that called itself a hotel. Cinder Gulch was not so much a town as a bite the timber companies had taken out of the mountain and not bothered to chew. A double row of false front buildings leaned over a street that was half mud and half bark, a company store, a saw works whose blades you could hear from the ridge. And above it all, where the cut timber gave way to standing forest and the standing forest climbed toward bare rock, the slopes had been stripped in long, ugly scars, and the slash left to dry, mountains of limbs and tops and crowns, piled head high and going brown in the sun. The animals had already started to leave. For 3 mornings the cliff swallows poured down off the high ridge low and wrong, and a half-blind store dog stood in the street at dusk growling up at the mountain. And not one man would look up from the mud to ask what they knew. The only question that mattered was whether anyone would understand what was coming before the mountain showed them. Naomi had not come for the timber. She had come for a teaching post in a valley 2 ridges north, a one-room school with a sound roof, the circuit agent had written, and 40 children who had never had a proper letter formed in front of them. She had a town trade and small use for it out here. Back in St. Louis, she had taught penmanship and sums to merchants' daughters, had drilled the loops and the capitals until the girls' hands moved like her own. Her fingers knew chalk and a steel nib, not a saw or an axe. But her father was 8 months dead of the consumption that had hollowed him a cough at a time. The academy had let her go inside a week because a grieving woman at the front of a classroom unsettled the paying parents, and the only things left in all the world that were hers were a single carved wooden token her mother had whittled before Naomi could walk, and her mother's wedding ring on a string around her neck. The token was the size of a thumbnail, a clumsy little bird with one wing carved longer than the other. Her mother had made it the winter Naomi was born, and told her later that a bird did not need both wings even to know the way home. The ring was thin gold worn nearly to a wire. Together they were the whole of the proof that Naomi Hart had ever belonged to anyone on this earth. The man in the fine dark coat was named Augustus Thorne, and he owned the timber lease, the sawworks, the company store, and a fair share of the souls who drew pay in Cinder Gulch. He was perhaps 50, soft in the belly and hard in the eye. With iron gray side whiskers and a flat-brimmed black hat, he did not take off indoors. He stood on the company store porch the afternoon Naomi arrived and told the gathered camp in a voice smooth as plain board that the talk of fire danger was the talk of nervous women and idle men. "I have cleared this country for 9 years," he said. "I know its moods better than it knows them itself." He said it like a man stating a thing he has decided is true, because the truth would cost him money. What the camp did not know, because Thorne had been careful that they should not, was that the territorial forest agent had ridden through in June and stood in Thorne's own office and told him to his face that the slash on the high slopes had to be burned in small controlled lots before the dry came on, or scattered or hauled, that a single dry lightning strike in August would take the whole valley. Thorne had poured the agent a glass of good whiskey and agreed with everything and burned not one pile, because burning costs wages and the standing timber 2 valleys over, that he could not yet afford, was about to come up cheap if the country it stood on were to, say, catch and clear itself. He had done the arithmetic that men like him always do. Burned land sells for nothing. The man who holds the lease when it burns, and the cash to buy the ash buys a mountain for a song. Augustus Thorne meant for Cinder Gulch Valley to burn. He only meant to be standing somewhere clean when it did. If you've ever watched the whole world decide a quiet, decent person wasn't worth stopping for, watch the wagons roll right past someone who would have stopped for you, and felt something in your chest go hard and certain that you would not have driven on, then you already understand what this channel is, and you already belong here. So take 1 second and subscribe, because the people who'd have turned that wagon around are exactly who I tell these stories for. Naomi watched the gray-muzzled store dog growl up at the high country the second evening and filed it away the same as she would have filed a sum that would not come right, a small wrong figure she had no time just then to chase. She had a man to find. The injured man was named Eli Pruitt, and he was no kin of hers, only the brother of the circuit agent who had arranged her post, an old timber cruiser who had broken his leg badly a week before when a green log rolled on him on the skid road, and who lay now on a cot in the back of the company store with the bone splinted and a fever coming and going, waiting for the next freight wagon north to carry him to a doctor and Naomi to her school. He was perhaps 70, white-haired, dry-humored, with hands like roots and eyes that had measured more standing timber than any man alive in that valley. He took to Naomi at once because she read to him and because she did not flinch at the leg, and because when he cursed the pain, she did not pretend to be scandalized. "You've a steady way about you, girl," he told her the second day. "Steadier than this whole camp put together. They're all looking down at the mud. Nobody's looking up at the hill." He was looking up at the hill even then, through the one back window at the brown slash drying in the sun. "That timber wants to burn," he said, "and that man on the porch wants it to." On the 3rd day, the mountain made up its mind. It did not build as the camp expected, slow and sorry, with a column of smoke a man might watch all afternoon and load his wagon at his leisure. That is the thing no one who has not lived through a crown fire understands. It comes down the wind in a single leaning wall, a whole summer of cured timber going up faster than a horse can run, and the first the lower camp knew of it was not smoke, but sound. A freight train roar rolling down off the high slopes where a dry lightning storm had walked across Thorne's unburned slash an hour before and lit it in a dozen places at once. Naomi was in the back of the company store with Eli Pruitt when the light in the window went from afternoon gold to a deep furnace orange, and the old man grabbed her wrist with his root of a hand and said very quietly, which was worse than shouting, "It's here. Help me up. Don't waste it being afraid." The street outside was already a panic. Wagons half-loaded and whipped into motion, men running, a woman screaming a child's name, the company's own freight teams bolting south down the stage road toward the lower crossing, while there was still a road to take. Augustus Thorne came out of his office with a strongbox under one arm and a fast saddle horse already waiting and was gone south in the first rush, not a backward glance, and the camp went out of Cinder Gulch in a single terrified stream behind him. And in all that streaming current of bodies and wheels, not one of them stopped at the back of the company store for an old crippled timber cruiser who could not run. Naomi could have gone. She wanted that understood later when she had the strength to want anything. The stream was right there in the street, and a young woman alone and quick could have caught a tailgate and ridden out of the valley alive. But Eli Pruitt could not stand without her shoulder under his arm, and the wagons were not slowing. And there is a kind of person who cannot make their feet carry them away from a helpless man, no matter what it costs, and Naomi Hart, to her own weary fury, was that kind. So she got him up. She got his arm over her shoulders and his weight half on her hip, and the two of them went out the back of the store and away from the burning slopes, hobbling toward the lower stage road and the crossing that led south out of the valley, the way everyone else had already gone, because south was away from the fire, and south was the only road there was. They were too slow. By the time they came down the cart track to the gully where the stage road crossed on a log bridge, the fire had run ahead of them on the wind along the ridge and dropped embers a half-mile out in front of itself, as the big ones do, and the far bank of the gully was already a sweep of blackened, smoking timber, and the bridge itself was a row of scorched and broken planks falling into the dry rocks below. The road out was gone. Naomi stood at the near end of the burned crossing with an old man sagging against her, and the heat coming up the gully at them like the open door of a forge, and she understood with the cold clarity of a column of figures that will not balance, no matter how many times you add it, that there was no way south. The fire was behind them, and the fire was now in front of them, and the only direction left in the whole world was up the bare rock toward the high country, which was no direction at all for a girl carrying a man who could not walk. She turned them anyway. Some animal part of her that had nothing to do with Sums turned them off the dead road and started them climbing toward the granite, because down was death for certain, and up was only death most likely, and most likely is a thing a person can walk into when certain is at her back. The smoke came down on them then, rolling gold and gray through the timber, and the bright spots bloomed behind her eyes, and Eli Pruitt's weight grew with every step until she was not so much helping him walk as dragging a dying man up a mountain toward a fire. And somewhere in the roar she stopped being able to tell up from down, and her knees found the rock, and she thought with a strange flat clarity that she was going to burn 2 ridges short of a schoolhouse she had never seen, with a wooden bird in her pocket and no one to know. And then a shadow came down through the smoke, huge and certain where everything else was chaos, a man going up into the fire instead of away from it. Caleb Vane had watched the valley burn from the start. That was the whole of his work and had been for 6 years. To sit a bare rock lookout above the tree line through the dry months and watch the country for the first thread of smoke and signal it down. And he had seen this fire born, had seen the dry storm walk across the high slash at first light, and the dozen small flames stand up and lean together and become one thing, and he had signaled it the only way he could. A heliograph flashed to a station 15 miles off that might or might not have a man awake at the glass. And then he had watched, helpless as God, while the thing he had warned of for 2 summers came true below him. He was 38 and looked it, and more, built long and heavy through the shoulders like something split from the same granite he lived on, with dark hair tied back and going gray at the temples, and a short beard he kept with a knife. A burned scar climbed the right side of his jaw and up the cheekbone, an old taut shine the color of a tallow candle, and another white scar cut through his left eyebrow. The burn he had got 11 years before, in a mill fire down in the flats, going back into the flames for a boy who turned out to be already dead, and he had carried out the body and the scar both, and gone up onto the rock not long after and mostly stayed there. He smelled of cold stone and pine pitch, and the particular dry char of a man who lived where the lightning struck. People down in the camp, the few times he came down, stepped out of his way without quite knowing why. He had no reason on this earth to come down off his safe high rock into a burning valley for two strangers he had never met. He came anyway. He had seen them through his glass, the small, dark shapes of a woman dragging a man up the dead end of the rock with the fire closing, and his body had been moving before the thought finished, as it had moved 11 years ago and never since unlearned. That thinking was the enemy of the next 10 seconds. He came down the granite he knew like the lines of his own hands, down a seam of rock no fire could climb, because nothing grew in it to burn, with a coil of rope over his shoulder and a wet bandana over his face. And he came out of the smoke above them at the moment Naomi's strength gave out. And he did not waste a word. "You can't outrun it. Get on my back." She could not have answered if she'd wanted to. The old man was the question, and Caleb Vane read it without asking. "Him first," he said, and he got Eli Pruitt up across his shoulders in a single practiced heave. 160 pounds of broken man, lifted like a sack of meal, and he said to Naomi, "Hand on my belt, and you let go. You die. Move." And he started up the bare seam of rock with the old man on his back and the woman's fists locked white on his belt, climbing away from the fire, up a stair of granite the flames could not follow. And behind them the timber they had stood in a minute before stood up all at once in a single roaring sheet of orange, and the heat of it shoved them up the mountain like a hand on the back. They climbed out of the worst of it onto a shoulder of rock, where the air, though hot and thick with smoke, no longer cooked, and Caleb laid the old man down and turned and looked at Naomi for the first time. And what she saw looking back at her was not warmth. It was the flat, appraising stare of a man checking whether a tool he'd picked up was cracked. "Can you climb?" he said. It was not really a question. "Lookout's another 200 feet up. The fire can't take the bare rock, but the smoke can take your lungs. We don't stop here." And the first thing Naomi's heart felt, before gratitude, before anything a softer story would have handed her, was a hot black wave of shame and fury that she was alive at all, and that this scarred, silent stranger had been the one to do it. She had spent her whole life paying her own way to the penny precisely so she would never have to stand where she was standing now, owing. And now she owed a debt no ledger she had ever taught could balance. A life, 2 lives, with the old man's. She turned her face away from him toward the burning valley and was sick onto the rock, and could not stop the tears, and hated him for the breath in her chest. He did not comfort her. He uncapped a canteen and put it in her hand and said, "Small swallows. You'll cramp." And then he picked the old man up again and started up the rock, and over his shoulder, flat as a man reading weather, he said the thing that began to undo her. 200 feet. Then you can fall apart all you want. Not yet. It took them the rest of that terrible afternoon to climb to the lookout, the fire raging in the valley below the whole way, the light gone red, and the sun a dull copper coin through the smoke. And by the time they came up onto the bare granite knob where the little timber cabin stood on its short stilts with its railed catwalk and its single shuttered window, Naomi's legs had stopped belonging to her, and the old man had gone gray and quiet on Caleb's back. The lookout sat on the highest bald rock for miles, a one-room box built to watch the world, a stove, a cot, a map table, a tall stool by the window, and a strange 3-legged instrument under a canvas hood that she would learn was the heliograph, the mirror he used to throw sunlight in code across 15 miles of mountain. Caleb laid Eli Pruitt on the cot and went to work on him without a word, splint and fever and all. The same hands that had carried two strangers up a mountain now moving over the old man with a startling gentleness. And Naomi stood in the doorway with the whole burning valley spread out below her and understood that she was looking at the inside of the man, this bare, swept room on a rock above the world. Everything in its place, nothing kept that did not earn its keep. "Stove's there," he said, not turning. "Wood's in the box. Get it lit. He needs heat more than you need rest." And that was the whole of his welcome. She got the stove lit. Her academy hands, soft and quick with a steel nib, fumbled the flint and steel a dozen times before the tinder caught, and her face burned with the shame of it. But he did not turn to watch her fail, and he did not offer to do it for her, and somewhere in the not watching there was a strange dignity, as if he had decided her struggle was hers to win, and it would insult her to take it. When the fire caught and the cabin began to warm, he laid the old man's head right and stood, unfolding to his full height under the low roof. And Naomi braced herself, because a price always came. A man did not carry two strangers up a mountain through a fire for nothing. She had learned that the world ran on debt the way that fire ran on dry timber. But Caleb Vane only filled a tin cup with water and set it on the map table near her, not handing it, just setting it where she could reach, and said, "There's a letter in the tin box on the shelf, addressed to a Hart, care of the North School. Came up with the freight a week back, waiting for you to pass through. You're the Hart." It was not a question, and he did not wait for an answer. He carried his bedroll out onto the catwalk in the smoke-red dark, and over his shoulder, flat as the weather, he said the thing that began to come between her and her certainty about men. "I won't touch you. The door bar's from the inside. Bar it if it makes you easier." And he pulled the door to behind him and left her alone in a warm room on a rock above a burning world with an old man, a letter she did not understand, and a bar she could throw against him if she chose. She did not eat at first, though there was hardtack and dried meat on the shelf, and she had not eaten since the morning. She sat on the floor by the cot with the fever-hot old man, and she waited for the catch, the price, the moment the door would open again on a different terms. It did not come. She heard Caleb moving on the catwalk, the small sounds of a man bedding down in the open. She heard the fire in the valley, a sound like the sea, a sound she would hear in her sleep for the rest of her life. And when the cold of the high rock had got so far into her that her pride could no longer hold it off, she ate the dry meat and drank the water, and she barred the door, not against him, she told herself, but because barring it was a thing she could still do. A single small coin of control on a day that had taken everything else. And she lay down on the floor by the cot in a blanket that smelled of wood smoke and cold stone, and slept the deep, ugly sleep of the nearly dead. And her last clear thought was that she still did not know the name of the man who had carried her out of the fire. If you've made it this far into Naomi's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. She opened the letter the second morning when there was light, and it changed the shape of everything that came after. It was from her father. He had written it 8 months before, in the careful, failing hand of a man who knew he was dying, and given it to the circuit agent to be carried north and held until she came through, a thing she was meant to find when she arrived safe at her school, not on a rock above a fire with the man who wrote it 8 months in the ground. She read it with the burning valley below the window, and the old man breathing rough on the cot, and her father's voice came up off the page as if he were in the room. He wrote that he was sorry to leave her with so little, that the academy money had gone to doctors and the doctors had been no use, that he had only ever had 2 things worth giving her, and the consumption had eaten the one. The other he wrote. Your mother's bird and her ring you have already, and I want you to hear from me, since I won't be there to say it. What your mother said to me the night she carved that wing too long on purpose, and I laughed at her for ruining it. She said a bird with one wing the same as the other only ever flies in a circle. It takes a crooked wing to break the pattern and strike out for somewhere new. You are the crooked wing, Naomi. You were always going to have to leave everything that was even to find the place you were meant for. Do not spend your life trying to balance a ledger with the dead. Owe the living instead. Let them owe you. And call it love, which is the only debt your mother and I ever found worth the keeping. Naomi sat on the floor of the lookout and wept over the letter in a way she had not let herself weep over the grave. And across the room, Caleb Vane, who had come in silent with an armload of wood, set it down without a sound and went back out and left her to it. And the not intruding was the first kindness of his she let herself feel as a kindness instead of a debt. The fire burned for 2 days and a night below them. They watched it from the rock, the three of them, the old man propped where he could see, and there was a terrible beauty to it that none of them spoke of. A whole valley of timber going up in towers of flame 1,000 feet high, the heat reaching them even on the high rock, the smoke turning the sun to copper and the moon to blood. Caleb worked through all of it. He kept the stove fed, and the old man dosed with a bitter willow bark tea and a steam of crushed eucalyptus leaves. He traded up from a packer, easing the smoke sickness in Eli Pruitt's chest. He hung wet blankets in the window against the heat and the ash. He watched the fire's edges with a fixed professional attention and told the old man, who understood such things, where it would run and where the bare rock and the wet draws would turn it. And Naomi, who could not bear to be useless, who had never in her life been able to bear it, began to do what he showed her, holding the steam cloth to the old man's face, warming the next dose, learning the strange economy of survival on a rock, and the wary mistrust that had stood between her and Caleb Vane since the smoke began, by the smallest degrees, to thin. On the 3rd day the fire passed. It did not go out so much as move on, having eaten everything in the valley worth eating, leaving behind a black and smoking ruin, under a sky finally going blue again, the standing dead trees like a field of spent matches, the camp of Cinder Gulch, a few smudges of ash and a brick chimney or two, and the silence after it was its own kind of roar. They had lived. The three of them on the rock had lived, while a valley died below them, and the living settled on Naomi like a weight she had not earned and did not know how to carry. She found Caleb on the catwalk that evening, looking down at the black valley, and she made herself say the thing that had been building in her for 3 days. "I'll work," she said, her chin up, her voice harder than she meant. "I'm not a charity case, and I won't be carried. Tell me what work pays for 2 lives, and I'll do it, all of it, however long it takes." She had meant it to sound like strength. It came out close to begging. Caleb looked at her a long moment, and the burned scar caught the last light, and what he said was so quiet under the wind that she nearly missed it. "Stop trying to pay me back." He turned the wet bandana over in his hands. "You came up my rock. I carried you the rest." A long breath. "That's not a ledger." His voice dropped, which in him was the nearest thing to anger, and his hands went still. Keep accounts on a thing like that, and it stops being worth anything. He looked at her. "You'll go cold inside, trying to balance it. I've watched a man do exactly that. So don't." It was the longest string of words she had heard from him. "Work because the work wants doing, and welcome," he said, "but not to pay me. That I won't take." It should have freed her. Instead, it broke something open in her chest. because Naomi Hart had spent her whole life believing that kindness was a loan and love was a transaction, and her own worth was the exact sum of what she could provide. And here was a scarred, half-wild stranger on a rock above a dead valley telling her that the largest thing anyone had ever done for her could not be bought back, was simply hers, free, a thing she would have to learn to carry instead of repay. She thought of her father's letter, "Owe the living, and let them owe you, and call it love," and she turned away so Caleb would not see her face. "Then I'll work because it wants doing," she said to the dark valley, and she did. What she could not do at first, she learned. Her academy hands, soft and quick with chalk, were worse than useless that first week on the rock. She burned them on the stove, split the heel of her thumb learning to dress out the marmots and grouse he snared for meat, raised blisters that broke and bled on the haft of the hatchet. Caleb neither coddled her nor mocked her. When she cut herself, he washed it with spirit that made her hiss and bound it with clean flannel, and said only, "Blade works away from your hand, not toward it. Turn it." When the hatchet glanced off a knot and nearly took her knee, he set the wood on a higher rock and showed her, once, the stroke that let the weight of the iron do the work instead of her shoulder, and then he went back to his own labor and let her fail at it until she did not. They couldn't go down for weeks. The valley below was a furnace of stumps and ash, too hot and too treacherous to cross. The freight road gone, the camp gone, and so the rock became their whole world, and the work of it filled their days. He taught her to read the country the way he read it, to watch the swallows in the wind, to know dry lightning weather from wet. He taught her the heliograph even, on the long afternoons, how to throw the sun off the little mirror in the short and long flashes that spelled words across the mountains, and she took to it as she had once taken to a clean column of sums, her teacher's mind delighting in the code of it. And the day she flashed a whole sentence to the relay station 15 miles off and got an answer back, Caleb almost smiled. The old man mended slowly on the cot, his leg knitting, his chest clearing, and he watched the two of them with the shrewd quiet of a man who had measured a great deal of timber and a fair number of people, and he kept his own counsel, mostly except once. "That man's been alone a long time," Eli told Naomi, low, while Caleb was out on the rock. "Longer than a body should be. You watch. He'll try to give you away before he'll let himself keep you. Men like that always do. They've decided they don't deserve the keeping." Naomi did not answer, but she filed it away, and it did not balance, and for once she did not try to make it. The thing that finally cracked the silence open between them was the heliograph and the dark. A night came, 10 days in, when the wind turned cold and a far-off dry storm walked the southern peaks, and Caleb sat up the whole night at the window with the lamp out, watching for the strike glow that would mean it had started again somewhere, and Naomi, who could not sleep for the old fear, sat up with him. They did not speak for a long while. And then, in the dark, looking out at the storm flicker on the far mountains, Caleb said, to the glass and not to her, "Had a family once, long time back, before I came up here." Naomi went very still, the way she had learned to go still around the wild things of the high country, so as not to spook the moment. Wife. A boy. The boy was 6. He turned the coal lamp in his hands. "Mill fire, down in the flats. I got my wife out." A pause, weighed and careful. Went back for the boy. A man at the door said he was already out. Already safe. His flat voice caught just once on a stone in the stream of it. I believed him because I wanted to. The boy was not out. By the time I knew it, the roof was down. He was quiet a moment. Went back in anyway. Carried him out. Too late by an hour. Got this for it. He touched the scar at his jaw without seeming to know he did it. Came up onto the rock the next spring. He looked out at the dark. A man screams up here. The only thing that hears him is the wind. And the wind doesn't ask questions. That suited me. He looked at her then, full on, the stormlight in the burn scar. I don't keep you here to pay a debt. He let that sit. I don't keep you here at all. The road'll open when the ash cools. You'll go to your school. The old man to his doctor. That's right and proper. He looked at her full on. I'm telling you so you know I mean it. You owe me nothing. You never did. And then he turned back to the window and the dark and left her sitting there with her mother's wooden bird in her hand, understanding for the first time that the silence she had taken for coldness was the sound of a man who had screamed into the wind for 11 years because he believed past arguing that he had let a child die and did not deserve to be heard. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that would not have been a coin tossed onto a thing that was past paying. But she reached over in the dark and put her hand on his forearm, the way you might steady a wild thing, and she left it there, and he did not pull away. And the two of them watched the far storm pass and not catch, and something between them that had been frozen since the smoke began went quiet and warm and unspoken. After that, the rock changed between them. Even as the valley below went on cooling, the black slopes streaked at last with the first green where the deep-rooted things came back. They were not lovers. He never reached for her, and she had stopped waiting for the price that was not coming. But they became something the plain speech of Cinder Gulch had no word for. She ran the near snares alone. She kept the lookout log in her clean schoolteacher's hand, the times and bearings of the heliograph traffic, and he watched her do it and shook his head once, slow, as if at a wonder. She caught a marmot in her own set, dressed it clean, and he held up the pelt and said, "Better handled than mine," and the earned respect in it, from a man who gave words away like he gave away anything, which was never landed in her harder than any embrace could have. She took the little wooden bird out of her pocket that night and set it on the window ledge of the lookout where the last light could find it. The clumsy thing with one wing carved long, and she let him see her do it, and he looked at it across the room a long moment and did not ask, and she did not explain, and the not asking and the not explaining were a whole conversation between two people who had spent their lives keeping accounts and were learning, slow as green comes back to a burn, how to stop. And that night when he carried his bedroll toward the catwalk out of habit, she said, "Oh, stove's warm in here and cold out there. Sleep inside. I'll bar nothing." And after a long moment, he set the bedroll down on the far side of the room near the door and lay down inside his own four walls for the first time in a season. And across the banked stove, two people who had each decided long ago to do their dying alone lay and listened to each other breathe and did not pretend it was nothing. She should have known the fire was not finished with her. Men like Augustus Thorne do not let the living walk around carrying the truth. While Naomi was learning the heliograph and Caleb was learning to sleep with another heartbeat in the room, Thorne had spent the weeks after the burn the way a careful man spends a windfall, quietly and with lawyers. The valley had burned exactly as he meant it to, and he had moved at once while the ash was warm, to buy up the scorched leases of the ruined and the dead for pennies, and to file on the standing timber 2 valleys north that the fire had conveniently spared, and it was all but done, a mountain bought for a song, when a clerk in the Territorial Land Office happened to mention to him that the forest agent's June report, the one that warned in plain ink that Thorne had been ordered to clear the slash and had not, was on file, and that a fire of suspicious origin on uncleared slash might draw a federal man to read it. Thorne went very still over his deed papers. The report alone was a danger, but a report could be lost. Clerks could be paid. What could not be paid was a living witness who had heard him refuse the agent's order with his own ears. And there had been one such, only one, an old timber cruiser named Eli Pruitt, who had been sitting in Thorne's outer office the June afternoon the agent came and gone, and who everyone in the ruined camp assumed had burned with the rest. And then a freighter, hauling the first load up the reopened lower road to the salvage crews, mentioned over whiskey that the fire watcher Vane had 2 people alive up at his lookout, an old crippled cruiser and a young schoolteacher that had been carried up out of the burn. Thorne set down his glass. The witness was alive. The witness was on a rock with a man who could not be bought, and a woman who had seen the letter. For he had learned of the letter, too, that the schoolteacher had had some paper of her father's, and in his guilty arithmetic, every loose thread became a noose. So Augustus Thorne stopped thinking about timber and started thinking about silence. He found 4 men down at the salvage camp who would do a thing for pay and not ask its name, and a territorial deputy named Sutton who held a grudge against the Forest Service and a fondness for Thorne's money. And he told them a story about a crippled old thief and a woman who had stolen papers and run up the mountain to a dangerous recluse, and that the law wanted all 3 brought down quiet, and Vane too if he made trouble. He did not tell them about the slash or the agent or the song he had bought a mountain for. Men like Thorne never tell you the real ledger. They only collect. The morning they came, Naomi smelled them before she saw them, and that was Caleb's teaching in her now. Smell before sight. Horses, the warm reek of sweated horse coming up the cooling rock from below where no horse had any business, and under it the cold oil smell of gunwork. Caleb was a half-mile out along the ridge, reading the burn for hot spots. She was alone at the lookout with the mending old man and her mother's ring at her throat. She did not panic. That surprised her later when she had room to be surprised by anything, that the woman who had wept on the rock at owing her life now stood at the catwalk rail and counted the riders coming up the switchbacks the way she had once counted chalk strokes, cold and exact. 6. 5 hard men with rifles across their saddle bows, and one with a deputy's star, and riding a little apart at the back, soft in the belly and hard in the eye, in a fine dark coat unburned by the fire he had set, the timber baron himself, come up at last to see his last loose threads cut. "Naomi Hart," the deputy called up, reining in below the rock. "You're wanted in the territorial seat on a complaint of theft. The old man with you's wanted for the same. Come down peaceable and bring the papers, and it goes easy on you." Behind him, the 4 hired men spread across the lower rock with the loose competence of men who had done such work before, and Augustus Thorne sat his horse at the back and looked up at her with the calculation she had seen on the store porch the first day, and Naomi understood the whole shape of it at once, as a column of figures comes clear when you find the single false entry, that this was not about theft and had never been about theft, that she and the old man and the letter were the false entries in Augustus Thorne's books, and he had ridden up the mountain to erase them. She did the thing Caleb had taught her. "There's no easy way up this rock, and the old man can't be moved fast," she called down, steady, buying the one thing that mattered, which was time and noise. "Give me a minute to get him ready." And she stepped back inside and barred the door and went to the wall where the rifle hung, the lever-action Winchester oiled and waiting in its place. The one Caleb had shown her once, flatly, because a person alone on a mountain should know how it loaded and how it threw and how you did not jerk it but squeezed. Her hands were not shaking. She noticed that, distant and wondering, the hands that had trembled over a flint and steel, that had wept at a debt, were steady now, steady as his, Because somewhere in a season of split thumbs and a letter from the dead, and a man who would not let her pay him back, Naomi Hart had stopped being a thing the world transacted and become a person the world would have to reckon with. She helped the old man to the floor below the window where the boards would shield him, and she put a second rifle in his root-hard hands because he had asked for it with his eyes, and she broke the shutter open an inch and laid the barrel in the gap and waited and prayed to a mother's wooden bird that the man who had carried her out of the fire would smell the gun smoke on the wind this once and come. He smelled it. He was a half-mile out when the first shot came, Deputy Sutton putting a round through the cabin door to frighten her into the open, and the flat, wrong crack of it carried along the bare rock where no gun should sound, and Caleb Vane dropped the burned branch he was sounding for heat and was moving before the echo died. He came back the way the fire had come down the valley, all at once, without warning, a season of cold patience let loose. He didn't come up the switchbacks where they would see him. He came along the high ridge and down the bare granite seam at the back of his own lookout, the rock he knew like his own scarred hands. And he came out of the dead black timber behind the hired men with the flat mechanical focus that had carried a child out of a burning mill too late. And the rock that had been 6 armed men against one barred door became, in the space of a held breath, something else. Naomi saw it from the window in the way of lightning, in pieces that do not join until afterward. The dark shape coming out of the char where no shape should be. The first hired man folding before the sound of it reached her. The others turning too slow, always too slow, against a thing that had spent 11 years on a rock, learning how not to be slow. And she understood, watching, that her part was not to wait to be saved. He had not come to save her. He had come to stand with her. And standing with someone means you carry your own end of the weight, the way she had held the steam cloth and split the wood and kept the log. And so she did not cower behind the bar. She worked the lever the way he had shown her, and she kept the window, and she made the open rock a place no man could cross to the cabin door and live easy. And between the two of them, the watcher loose among them on the ground, and the schoolteacher steady at the glass, the 6 became 5, and the 5 became a scatter of men who had been paid to frighten a woman and hadn't been paid for this. What happened on the rock happened fast, as the truly violent things do, and afterward Naomi could never lay the pieces of it down in order. She remembered the window. She remembered Thorne shouting at the hired men to fire the cabin, to burn her out the way he had burned the valley, to end it the only way he knew, and one of the men swinging down with a brand he'd lit from his own lantern, and her own voice gone, and her finger taking up the slack on the Winchester the way Caleb had shown her. Squeeze. Don't jerk. And the man with the brand spinning away from the door, with the torch flung wide and guttering out against the wet of the morning rock, and the hired men all at once understanding that the woman behind the door was not freight, was not the easy thing they had been promised. And then Caleb was among them. He took the first man down before any of them knew he was there, with the flat of a hatchet and no wasted motion. The second turned, and Caleb was already inside his rifle, too close to shoot, and put him down, too. The men had been paid to terrorize a crippled old man and a woman. They had not been paid for a thing that came out of the burn-smelling of cold stone and silence, and did not seem to feel the one wild round one of them got off. And their courage, which had only ever been the courage of numbers and an easy mark, broke. 2 of them ran for the horses. Deputy Sutton swung his pistol toward the cabin window, and Naomi, steady, squeezed, and his arm jerked aside and the pistol went skittering across the rock, and he was running for his horse with his star and his lawful complaint forgotten, the way Thorne's kind always run the instant the price of the thing climbs past the pay. And then it was only Augustus Thorne, alone in the middle of the bare rock on a horse that danced under him, soft in the belly and wide in the face, his hired courage fled and his deputy bleeding, and the truth standing in the cold morning sun at last. Caleb came across the rock toward him with the hatchet low and the burned scar livid at his jaw, and a stillness on him worse than any shout. And Thorne did the only thing his kind ever does. He pleaded the paper. "There's a lawful complaint," he said, his smooth voice gone high and cracking. "Theft. The papers, the old man, she stole. You're interfering with the law, Vane. I'll have you." And there Naomi Hart came out of the cabin door with the Winchester still in her hands, level, steady, and she finished his sentence for him in a voice he had heard once before, smooth off a store porch. "The papers," she said. "You mean the forest agent's report?" Her chin did not drop. "The one that says in plain ink you were ordered to clear that slash, and you didn't." She held his eye. "The one that says you were warned in June to your face that the valley would burn." She walked toward him and he backed his horse and couldn't back it far enough. "You let it burn. You wanted it to burn." She took another step. A whole valley, the camp, the men who didn't get out. Also, you could buy the ash cheap and the north timber cheaper. Her hands were not shaking, and one old man heard you refuse that order. One woman read the truth of it. So you rode up here to finish what the fire started. She let the silence carry it. "I taught sums and letters for 6 years, Mr. Thorne. I know what a cooked ledger looks like." She nodded at the cabin. "The old man in there is alive. He heard you. And I'll write every word of it in a clean hand for the federal man. We're the witnesses. Both of us." She did not raise the rifle to him. She did not have to. The raising of it would have made her his kind, a person who settles a thing in blood. Instead, she lowered it deliberately and let him watch her decide that she did not need it, that the worst thing she could do to Augustus Thorne was not to kill him, but to leave him alive in a world that was about to know exactly what he was. "Ride down," she said, "to the land office, the marshal, the newspaper if there is one." Her voice did not rise. "Tell them what you did before I do." She did not blink. "The old man and I are coming down behind you. We'll tell everyone we meet." Her voice went flat and certain. "There's not enough money in all your fine coats to buy the truth back once it's loose." Augustus Thorne looked from the woman with the steady rifle to the scarred man with the hatchet to the empty rock where his bought courage had fled, and the calculation went out of his eyes and left only the thing that had always been under it, which was fear, and he wheeled his horse and went down the mountain at a run, and the deputy went after him clutching his bloodied arm, and the thing the fire had started in the high slash ended on a bare rock in the morning sun, with no one dead on that rock at all, which is the only kind of ending worth the having. The truth went down the mountain ahead of him on the tongues of a freighter and a salvage boss, and at last a federal land agent who read the June report and then took down, in Naomi Hart's clean and careful hand, the sworn account of an old timber cruiser who had heard Augustus Thorne refuse a lawful order to clear the slash that burned a valley, and the leases Thorne had bought for a song were voided, and the north timber with them, and a charge was drawn for the fire and for what came after, and a man who had cut a corner to buy a mountain lost the mountain and a great deal more, which is a slower justice than a bullet and a truer one. But that is not the part of the story that matters. The part that matters happened after, in the quiet on the rock, the way the things that matter always do. Caleb came to her across the rock, and for the first time since the fire he reached for her, slow, giving her every chance to step back. and he put his ash-streaked hand against the side of her face the way he had gentled the fevered old man, and she didn't step back. "Your hands weren't shaking," he said. It was the highest thing he knew how to say. "No," she said. "You taught me." And they stood like that on the high granite with the black valley going green far below, and the clean blue sky washed at last of smoke, and neither of them said the word a softer story would have made them say, because they had earned a thing that lived past words. He tried once to give her the road. That was the last test, and the truest, and the one that proved he had meant every flat thing he had ever said to her. And it came exactly as old Eli had warned. He'll try to give you away before he'll let himself keep you. A week after the rock, with the lower road open and the salvage wagons running and a doctor waiting in the seat for the old man's leg, Caleb laid a small heavy thing on the map table where he had once set a tin cup of water she would not at first take. It was a leather pouch, and it clinked. "Government pays a fire watcher in coin. 6 years of it up here, nothing to spend it on," he said, not looking at her, looking out the window. "It's yours. All of it." He pushed it an inch toward her. "Enough for the North School. Books, a stove, a winter's wood. Or anywhere else you'd rather go. A woman with your head could run her own academy in a city." He still would not look at her. "You don't owe me a season of your life because I was on the rock above you when the world caught fire. The road's open. You should take it." And he said it so steadily, at such cost, that she understood he believed it was the right thing, the unselfish thing, to open his hand and let her go the way he had refused to let her pay the debt, that he was telling her in the only language he had that he loved her. By trying to give her up before he could let himself want to keep her. Naomi Hart picked up the pouch. It was heavy, heavier than everything she had carried up the mountain, heavy as a future. And she carried it across the room to the loose board under the window that he kept a little dry powder under against the damp. And she lifted it, and she set the pouch down in the cold dark under the floor of the lookout, and laid the board back over a small fortune, the way you bury a thing you have decided you do not need. Then she took her mother's ring off the string at her throat, the thin gold worn to a wire, the one thing besides the wooden bird that proved she had ever belonged to anyone, and she set it on the window ledge where he would see it every day. Not on her hand, not a wedding, nothing the speech of Cinder Gulch had a word for, but a thing left in the open between two people who had stopped keeping accounts. "I read my father's letter up here," she said. "He told me a bird with one wing the same as the other only ever flies in a circle, that it takes a crooked wing to break the pattern and strike out for somewhere new." She set the carved wooden bird on the ledge beside the ring, the clumsy little thing with one wing carved long. "I spent my whole life trying to balance a ledger nobody was keeping but me. I'm done." She set her hand flat on the stone over the buried pouch. "The pouch stays under the floor. I'll teach the North School, and I'll come up this rock between terms." She glanced at the mirror by the door. "I'll learn the whole code of that glass till I can throw a sentence clear to the next mountain. Not because I owe you, because I choose this. That's the only kind of staying that was ever worth a damn." And Caleb Vane, who had carried a dead boy out of a fire too late and screamed into the wind for 11 years and learned that no one was coming, looked at the ring on his window ledge and the crooked bird beside it, and the woman who had dragged herself up out of his burning valley and out of a lifetime of believing she was a thing to be bought and sold. And he did the thing he hadn't done since before the mill burned. He let himself be found. He crossed the room and he took her cracked, calloused, capable hands in his scarred ones, and he held them as you hold the one thing the fire cannot have, and he said the only word that was ever big enough, which was her name. And outside the high lookout, The burned valley went on greening through the summer and the fall, the deep roots throwing up fireweed and then aspen, as a burn does, as it always does. And the old man healed and went to his brother in the north and sent letters. And two broken people who had refused to quit, found in the most merciless country either of them had ever known. The one thing that cannot be bought or owed or repaid, but only chosen, freely in the open, with a crooked wooden bird to witness it. They say a forest that burns clean comes back stronger than the one that never burned at all. That some seeds will not open at all until the fire comes for them. So tell me, down in the comments, because I have been turning it over myself, when the smoke came down the valley and the wagons rolled and the only safe thing to do was to run with the rest, would you have caught a tailgate and saved yourself, the way the whole camp did? Or would you have turned back through the smoke for an old man who could not walk, the way Naomi did, knowing it might cost you everything? Run with the wagons or turn back into the smoke? Tell me which one you are, and I'll see you up the ridge next week.